I mean, the reason the recent government proposals about dropping Islam and dropping jihad and dropping mujahideen are insane is they allow our enemies to define the language by which we're allowed to talk about our enemies. And when you start doing that, you can't win. This is why one of the great breakthroughs that the governor and then President Reagan brought was everybody, the M in 1979, 1980 was détente. President Reagan moved the M to evil empire. Now, you can have détente with a slightly bad dictatorship that, after all, is permanently here, and let's be realistic. You don't have détente as a long-term strategy with an evil empire. You have victory. That's why his most important single sentence in the 1980 campaign was when he was asked by a reporter, what's your vision of the Cold War? And he said 4 words that change history. We win, they lose. That's moving the M decisively, because over here was we appease, they gain ground. Over here was we win, they lose. When he began campaigning in 1966, something I was personally involved in, the center of gravity on welfare was welfare is the necessary payment by lucky Americans to unlucky Americans, and you are vicious, cruel, and greedy if you're not willing to take care of the poor. By 1996, when we finally passed fundamental welfare reform, and 65% of those in welfare either went to school or went to work, we had moved the M over here. And welfare was the destructive payment to people for doing nothing, which was ruining them and their children. Well, that's a fundamental reshaping of the debate. And so this concept I found fascinating. I want to add to it 2 other things. When you read The Education of Ronald Reagan, I went back and I gave a speech you can find if you go to my website, newt.org, if you go to the American Enterprise Institute. I gave a speech on the 2 great March 1983 speeches. Within 13 days, President Reagan gives the Evil Empire speech and the Strategic Defense Initiative speech. The lecture I gave at AEI was fundamentally different because of having read The Education of Ronald Reagan, because I suddenly realized something I should have recognized 20 years ago. Reagan was not a great communicator. Reagan was a great educator. The design of his speeches, and I've studied under Deming and under Drucker, and it's very eerily similar to what Deming did. The design of the Reagan speeches is to surround you with facts in such a way that you have to reach his conclusion. And so he's creating a fact-based rather than ideologically based model. Now, because his facts are selected from a viewpoint that has a certain set of values, there's clearly an underlying ideology. But these are not ideological speeches. These are not speeches designed simply to arouse the emotion. These are speeches designed to give you information to go back home and talk to your neighbors and actually come to a different conclusion. And when you read them, they're very dense. I mean, there's a whole section in the Strategic Defense Initiative speech where he goes through how many tanks we built, how many tanks they built, how many subs we built, how many subs... I mean, there's not a consultant on the planet that would have approved that speech. But Reagan knew what he was doing. He also did something else that I have spent a long time studying, and I didn't fully appreciate. And it's a characteristic which Washington and Wellington and Lincoln and FDR also had. And it's a fundamental mistake the current administration has made, and it's a fundamental mistake of the Harvard Business School model. All great transformational leaders understand that you have to have a level of detailed understanding that allows you to go to the very bottom and make what looks like a very small change that the Harvard Business School model would tell you was micromanagement. But in fact, it is fundamentally changing reality by doing something small that has a very large consequence. This piece of wall is a perfect example. And if you look at the recent idiotic proposals by the federal government on abolishing the use of accurate language in the war on terror, and then you go back and remember that when Reagan first wrote in, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, the State Department censor took it out on the grounds that we shouldn't offend Mr. Gorbachev. President Reagan wrote it back in a second time. It was taken out a second time. President Reagan then called Secretary Shultz and said, Georgie, you need to tell your editor that I am the president, he is not. Now, why is this important? It's important because the president understood that you had to go all the way down to a specific fundamental insight from which everything else would fall. So, you use the words evil empire, you just redefined the entire nature of the Cold War. You launched a strategic defense initiative, you just explained to the Soviets you were going to bankrupt them because they couldn't possibly compete with you in a science and technology-based entrepreneurial model. You go out and you say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. You just said to the entire State Department, Foreign Service, I actually expect you to be anti-communist. It was a bitter moment. It didn't fully work, but he temporarily held them at bay. Now, why am I sharing all this with you? You have a piece of paper which introduces you to American solutions and to the platform of the American people. Several of you have been very flattering today. I did not run this year because I believe in a Clint Eastwood line that a man has to know his limitations. Callista and I had a very long conversation about this last year, and I believe that we are in the early stages of the third wave of conservative evolution in my lifetime. I believe that the first wave was launched by Bill Buckley and Barry Goldwater. I believe the second wave was launched by Ronald Wilson Reagan and then culminated in the contract with America, which I believe was the last great achievement of Reaganism and actually was part of the same cycle. And I believe we have been floundering for a decade while a group of people who didn't have a clue, didn't study history, didn't understand Reagan, despised what we stood for, have floundered around and ruined the Republican Party and driven us back to a 1974 level of incompetence. And yet, much like the president, I'm an optimist. This is America. There are 300 million plus people here. We're the most successful integrator of people from across the planet in the history of the human race. We're the most successful liberator of human energy in the history of the human race. We offer more chances for more people to create more things than any society in history. And the only reason you have to be worried is because the structures of government and the structures of academia that you've been supporting with your tax money are so fundamentally stupid. Now, if that's true, the answer is simple. Change them. And change them even while the politicians and the interest groups are screaming. And we know how to do this. We've done this 8 times. The Founding Fathers rebelled against the British Empire. The Federalists rebelled against a system that wasn't working. The Jeffersonians rebelled against the Federalists. The Jacksonians rebelled against the entire establishment. The Lincoln Republicans caused a rebellion of such a scale that it led to the largest and most bitter war in American history. The progressives ultimately came to dominate both political parties for a 20-year period and fundamentally modernized government into a 20th century corporate industrial urban model. The New Deal came along and fundamentally reshaped large parts of our society, and the Reagan Revolution came along and in profound ways reshaped the economy, the civic culture, the foreign policy, and the economics of America. Those are 8 enormous waves of change. In every single case, the power structure hated them. The power structure was infuriated. The power structure was deeply opposed. And the American people said, fine, you failed. Get out of the way. And it comes down to that simple. My book, Real Change, has as its subtitle, From the World That Fails to the World That Works. And see, I'm a happy warrior. I'm an optimist. I'm an enthusiast because I get to represent the world that works. I mean, think how hard it is if you are a Washington establishment figure trying to defend the world that fails. Let me give you a couple of quick examples, if you don't mind. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to take questions a little bit. But I really want to share this with you because I think this is one of the great turning points, and I think that American solutions will be to the next 20 years what Citizens for the Republic and the Heritage Foundation were in the 1970s.